more in next week. So today I wanted to just check in with everyone, and we're going to do a bit of a recap because it's been quite a long time since we did our other sessions. What I wanted to also ask everyone is if you managed to do that robot tutorial that we were working on at the end of last year. I don't know if people were able to do it on their own. If you are someone who is likely to be running the model again in future, it's great if you're able to try it on your own. So I just wanted to hear from people if they were able to try it and if it's working, if it worked for them. Ntando, were you able to run it?
From my side, I actually didn't get a chance to go through the output files and everything, but I'm sure from the team we do have guys who are very far ahead in terms of running the model. But yeah, I think even from the last time we did look at some output files, but from my
Yes.
side, I didn't have a chance to run it for myself. I haven't got to the chance.
All right. I'm just wondering if there's anybody on the call who did manage to, I just want to get an idea of who did manage to run it, who actually, well, if you tried to run it and you had any problems. Because then I want to know if I should allocate time to talking about that today. If you, hi, Rebecca, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going around to see if anybody managed to get the tutorial model from last year. It's the one that came, the generic one that comes with the download of SWAT Plus that we were going through using as a demonstration. I wanted to get a sense of who's managed to run it on their computer. Samani, did you manage to run it?
I think the first model did run, yeah, but I've now lost, I think I've lost touch because I haven't had time to catch up with everything, but the first run, it did actually run.
Okay, great. Nwabisa, did you manage to run it? Okay, maybe I won't go through. I thought I should just check if anybody managed to. Hi, Nwabisa, sorry. You were about to start talking.
Hi. Hi, Julia. No, I haven't managed to run it. I will continue and then try and learn from others if I struggle.
Okay. I just wanted to, yeah, I wanted to check a sense of where everybody is with it. It sounds like most people haven't managed to run it. Has anyone on the call managed to run it? Was the money you did run it? You just said the file is not around anymore because of moving on with other things.
I know it's fine. I will catch up via the recorded.
No, I just, yeah, it'll influence a little bit where we go with when I leave time to do troubleshooting and that kind of stuff. So we'll come back to that. I'll let people settle in. Yeah, so hi Ntando, you wanted to.
I'm not sorry, Julia, just for the benefits of everyone, I think what we can do, even though we do have recordings, but looking at the fact that most of us didn't get to that point where we have a running model, I think if we can dedicate maybe a few minutes to recap the output files, just as a reminder before we go deeper into the actual uMngeni catchment model, because I know that most of us will recap and get to the point where we are going to run this model as soon as possible. But just for the benefit of everyone, if you can allocate the time to
Yeah.
to repeat.
Sure. Great. So I think, there's some more people. Great. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. I know you've just been in a meeting marathon, probably. So I think a lot of the purpose of this this session today will be a recap of things, just because it has been a long time. It sounds like I do want to, once people have, like, over the next weeks, if you are catching up from the tutorial from the previous sessions from last year and you're able to getting it running on your machine, I'm happy to allocate time to answer people's questions about where specifically they've been getting stuck, and that kind of thing. But I wasn't sure whether to allocate time for that today or not, for any like specific questions. But we can come back to that next week or the following week, maybe, if people are getting stuck. I'm happy to answer those kind of troubleshooting questions or that. So what we did, just to step back into the course from last year, so we did quite a bit of overview of what is hydrological modeling and what's quality modeling in general, and then how does SWAT Plus do these calculations, and what do you need to set up a SWAT model. And we looked at the software using the tutorial, and part of the reason for that is that it's the tutorial model is a lot simpler and quicker to run than the model we built of the uThukela water catchments, because it's a large area. So today, so from now, the next few sessions, I wanted to get into more of how the uThukela water catchment areas model is set up, what the inputs were, and how the input data is prepared. And then next week, start looking at, well, I think this week and next week we'll be going through input data. And then the following, I planned for 4 more sessions. We'll have to see. I might have to condense now. We lost a week, but, or if, yeah, depending on people's timeline. And then the output data processing. And then what kind of scenarios people would want to be modeling and how one might do that in this model. So I'm going to recap our sessions from last year today quite quickly. That 10-minute break, we might just do a shorter break midway through, because I'm sure everybody needs to run and get a drink or something. And then we'll start getting into more of the specifics about the inputs for the uThukela catchments. So please do jump in. While I'm giving a presentation, sometimes I can't see if you put your hand up because I'm looking at my slides and my notes and those kinds of things. So feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. Don't be shy. And then you'll get more out of things. So please, oh, sorry, my slides are progressing on there. Oh, yeah, please don't hesitate to ask questions as I go. You can interrupt me. So I'm going to whiz through some of this because it's all recap, but it's a good foundation for what we're going to work with. So big overview, a numerical hydrological model takes inputs of rainfall, generally other climate variables that dictate the evaporative demand. So that's like temperature, solar radiation, humidity, wind, and then other catchment property descriptors. So like vegetation cover, soil properties, slope, all of that. And then you translate that into a model structure, and then there are algorithms that are the equations, and the outputs are stream flow, evapotranspiration, soil moisture storage, groundwater storage, and so forth. So some definitions of these terms, just because I use them quite a lot. Model structure is the modeled spatial units, so like subcatchments, stretch river reaches, water bodies. And this model structure also includes how these areas are connected to one another. So what flows into what flows into what. And then the algorithms are equations and rules that determine how water moves between units. So yeah, does it move between the land and the stream? Does it move between the soil and the groundwater? Does it move between the land surface and going into the soil, etc.? So these are like the equations that let you estimate things like infiltration, evapotranspiration, groundwater recharge, stream flow, overland flow, etc. And then parameters are, sorry, my presentation is, I tried to set it to go on my clicks, but it seems to be going on time instead of clicks for some reason. I'll try and set. Parameters are these values that are used in the equations that account for the specific case or the setting. So things like the soil porosity or the density of the land cover, how much impervious surface there is, these kinds of things. And then there's the input variables, which is generally the rainfall and the climate. But it can also be water management time series, like how much is pumped from here to here. So mostly time series data, that's an input that you have to prepare. And then you have your output variables of stream flow, evapotranspiration, groundwater storage, and these are what is calculated by those algorithms. So SWAT does all of this for hydrology, but it also calculates other processes as well. So it actually calculates plant growth using some simple growth curves and temperature, and you can control how it does that to some degree, and that lets people do crop modeling. It also does erosion modeling, so it tracks sediment movement based on the overland flow. And we went through how it does some of this last time, and then there's last sessions. There's nutrient cycling as well, so the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles. And then movement of nitrogen and phosphorus across the landscape and into the stream. So it's doing all of these at a fairly, it's a medium complexity level, I'd say. And pesticides, pathogens, heavy metals, and salts. The pathogen routine is not yet in SWAT Plus, but it apparently has been coded. They just haven't validated that it's working right yet, and they're going to release it hopefully later this year. So then it could just update the version, and it should be able to output the pathogen outputs. And then land management, and what I mean by that is you can input things like irrigation, fertilizer application, manure application to the landscape, and those kinds of things, and then it will add that into the model. And that's going to control the runoff and the loads of the sediment and nutrients that enter the streams. And then once water and nutrients and sediment are in the stream, it also calculates in-stream routing. So that's how fast the water moves through the stream channels. And then in-stream transport of sediment, nutrients, pesticides, pathogens, etc. And then storage in reservoirs and ponds and outflow of that. So to show this in picture form for the hydrology, you've got the precipitation input. It can either infiltrate or it runs off the surface. And if it infiltrates into the soil, it can, and even from the surface, you can have evaporation and transpiration. And then there's the soil moisture redistribution between the layers, and you can have lateral flow and then percolation downwards into the shallow aquifer. And then lateral flow, sometimes people call that, in South Africa, we generally call that interflow, I've seen more commonly, but within SWAT, it gets termed as lateral flow. And that's generally happens when you get some saturation in the soil because it's being blocked by more dense material below. So it flows, instead of going downwards as much, it goes laterally and can enter the stream. And then you can have groundwater recharge. And then you can have, sometimes the roots can reach down to the groundwater, depending what the aquifer and the soils are like, where the water table is sitting. So you can have, in SWAT, they end up calling it revap, like in this diagram it's called revap, but that's essentially the border, at the border of the groundwater table and the soils. If the roots are sitting there, they can actually withdraw from the groundwater in the model, which happens when you have deep roots, especially. And then you can have a deep aquifer in the model where the groundwater in the deep aquifer doesn't have any exchange with the stream, whereas a shallow aquifer in the model does. So you can choose to use the deep aquifer or not. It depends if you think there is some aquifer that does not interact with the stream. So then to add the water quality part onto that, you have nutrient cycling in the landscape. And then you have how much is in the surface runoff. You have how much nitrogen and phosphates might be in the lateral flow through the soils, how much might be in the recharge that gets to the groundwater, how much goes of the, nitrogen and phosphates might move from the groundwater into the stream that way. And then once it gets to the stream, there are processes of things can degrade, like the nitrogen phosphate can change forms, the sediment can settle or be picked up depending on the stream velocity that's getting calculated. And then you have point sources being added along the stream network. And you have your sediment load, and some of the sediment load can also carry nitrogen and phosphate. So that's being taken into account. Also, the plant growth part influences the nitrogen and phosphates in the soils to some degree that it models. So it's calculating all of this. And it's calculating all of this within a structure. So it calculates all of this for a stream network. They've broken up the stream into individual channels at confluences, and you can break the stream network up into different segments at points that you have interest in as well. And then you break the land area up into subcatchments, and every stream unit has a subcatchment. And you can have subchannels within the subcatchments as well. And then you have landscape units, which is like an upland and a floodplain or a lowland area within the subcatchment. And then within each landscape unit, you divide that up further into what's called HRUs, so hydrological response units that feed the stream or the channel reaches. So that's the unit. The HRUs are the units at which the surface and the soil hydrological processes are being calculated. And then you have your aquifers for the groundwater that underlie. And the aquifers are at the landscape unit scale. So within a subcatchment, you'll have an upland aquifer and a lowland or a floodplain aquifer. So to show that in another way, first of all, the hydrological response units are units that have the same land cover type, the same soil type, and the same slope class that you determine how many classes of each of those things you want to model as separate. So how many land cover types do you want to distinguish? How many soil types do you want to distinguish? How many slope types do you want to distinguish? All of those are overlaid on top of each other to come up with these units that we think should respond similarly when they receive a similar amount of rainfall. So those are HRUs, the hydrological response units. So to show that in another way, we've got, just shows like a hill slope being broken up into 3 HRUs, 2 upland ones, one that has trees and one that doesn't have trees, and then a third one that's at the floodplain that's in the lowland close to the stream. And then the aquifer would be divided into an upland and a floodplain aquifer. And this little panel here shows a catchment divided into subcatchments and also uplands and lowlands with the stream network. So the routing, you would have these different HRUs in your uplands. They would get routed to your floodplain HRU, or your floodplain, landscape units, and then to the stream. And then your model structure can also have reservoirs and dams in it that act as storage bodies along the stream that receive everything coming in from the streams, and then the land that's flanking them directly. So what kind of data do we need to set up this model? We need rainfall, and we also need, in general, sorry, this slide was a general one. So atmospheric evaporative demand, when I say pan evaporation, you can actually use pan evaporation in SWAT, but it's quite, you have to, it's not really designed for that. So you have to do they allow you to do it, but it's a lot of extra settings, and they really advise to try and input the other variables if possible. So I've set it up using the other climate inputs to use to calculate evaporative demand. So temperature, solar radiation, relative humidity, and wind speed. You need data on the catchment properties, like land cover and properties, soil types and properties, underlying geology and aquifer properties, channel network properties. And then also anthropogenic activities that influence both the hydrology and the water quality. So you have your external inputs, your point sources, withdrawals of water, transfers of water, storages, dams and their inflow or their release rules, and any pumping out of them, irrigation practices, fertilizer application, grazing, crop management, and impervious connectivity. And then if you have stream flow data, we use that to check how well the model's doing, and water quality observation data gets used to check how well the model's doing. If you happen to have soil moisture and groundwater data and any measurements of actual evapotranspiration, then you can also check how the model's doing on those. So the calibration and validation data, you don't need it to set up a model and run it, but you do need it to check if your model's any good. As we looked at in the previous sessions, SWAT has quite a lot of parameters for the land cover types, the soil types, the aquifers, and the connectivity, just because it is modeling a lot of things. So there's the hydrology, but it's also modeling nitrogen, phosphorus, cycling plant growth, sediment movement, all of that. So each one of calculating all those things requires a lot of information about like how much nitrogen do you have in the soil to start with, and how much nitrogen is applied in the fertilizer, and what's the porosity of the soil, etc. So I'll go through how I got values for a lot of these things. Some of them are SWAT defaults, some of them are from like the Agricultural Research Council, some of them are from the ACRU modeling databases, etc. So we have to, and there is a SWAT default input database that the SWAT model comes with. So if you pick land cover types in their existing database, it will have parameter values for these, and it will come with the aquifer, like defaults for the aquifer. So you could set up the model and run it with the defaults, but then you don't expect it to perform that well for your area necessarily. So you have to dig in and see what it's assuming for all of these things and modify them. So we went through some of these and the website where you can see all the tables of them, what the units and etc. So that we looked at those within the SWAT editor. And then this website also has lots of tables of them you can go through and have a look. There are a lot of parameters. I have gone through quite a bit of literature on SWAT where people do sensitivity analyses, which is where you tweak, you change values of different input parameters, and you see how much the output stream flow changes, or the output groundwater, if that's your primary interest, or your output crop production, etc. But these ones are for stream flow, to see what are some of the most sensitive parameters in the model, so that if your model's not performing very well against your observed stream flow data, which things would you want to look at adjusting? And so this is just like a table that shows you, I think there's like 20 of them, because I think there's like 50 or 60 parameters types, and then sort of for each land cover and soil type, you know, depending on how many soil types and land cover types you have, they would have their own sets. So you can get up to lots of individual values. But so, to give you an idea of some of the most sensitive ones, quite an important parameter in the SWAT model, and the one that everybody talks about as being one of the most important ones for calibrating at a first level, is what they call the curve number. And that's something that determines the infiltration versus surface runoff generation with the rainfall. And then it gets adjusted by the soil moisture on the day that the rainfall comes. So if the soil's already wet from previous rain, you expect more runoff to be generated. But if the soil is dry, more infiltration will happen before you start getting surface runoff. And then the curve number value determines sort of how much runoff you would get for, it says there for soil moisture condition number 2. So like medium moisture soil, and then it gets adjusted up and down based on what the soil moisture in the model is on the particular day. And that parameter is an important one. And then there's other ones that determine how long it takes for surface runoff to move from an upper area to the stream and across the landscape essentially. And then for evapotranspiration, you have things like canopy interception, the leaf area index of the vegetation cover type, the root depth of the vegetation cover type. There are two values there, ESCO and EPCO, and they control evapotranspiration throughout the soil profile. And that is the distribution. It's like if you run out of water at the top of the soil, can water be withdrawn from lower layers in the soil to compensate? And that has to do with how well you think, like some plants are very efficient at withdrawing water from deeper. And it can also be if you have cracks in your soil, it depends on the soil type. Some soil types ends up when it's dry, it has cracks, and that you can have evaporation from deeper and macropores and those kinds of things. And then how much water can the vegetation draw from the groundwater table? You also have soil properties that are very important, like the total soil depth, the available water holding capacity of the soil, the conductivity of the soil, how well water percolates out of the bottom of the soil into the groundwater. And then you have things like the rates at which water can flow out of the groundwater, out of the aquifer into the stream. And you have the roughness of the channel. And then also you might have transmission loss, water being lost from the channel into the stream bed. So these are some of the most sensitive parameters from a hydrology point of view, to give you an idea, but there are other ones as well. And then we also talked a bit about model output. And SWAT produces daily and daily at least, and at most high resolution would be daily, but you can get outputs monthly or yearly or however you would like them. For every landscape element, so for every HRU, every aquifer, any landscape unit, any subcatchment, you can get the runoff that's leaving it, reaching the stream with a water body, the surface runoff, the lateral runoff, the groundwater runoff. You can get the sediment and the nitrogen and the phosphorus that is carried in the surface runoff, in the lateral runoff, in the groundwater runoff. You can also get other parts of the water balance for that unit. So for any HRU, you can get the whole water balance of that individual unit, or for the whole subcatchment if you want to. So you can get how much water was applied for irrigation, the evapotranspiration, the soil moisture, groundwater recharge, etc. So you can produce a lot of outputs if you want them. It will fill up your computer hard drive if you save everything for every small unit, but you can decide what you want to save, or you can do separate runs and different analyses of all these things, or you can save things at the subcatchment level. But it's good to know that you can get all of these outputs for any unit in your model should you want them, because it's calculating all of this. You can get the other parts of the chemistry balance for the unit, so the fertilizer and the manure application. So you might say that's an input, but sometimes you're inputting rules for these things. So you input rules of when the irrigation is applied. It'll only apply the irrigation when the soil gets dry, if you think that's what the farmers are doing. So you can input those rules, and then what you can output is how much irrigation the model actually decided to put on given every day, given the rules that you have set up. You can output the vegetation growth and the leaf area index, the biomass, the canopy cover, and the rooting depth of the vegetation as a time series for all of these units. And then for stream units and water bodies, you can do the inflow and the outflow, the concentrations of sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus in the inflow and the outflow of every stream unit, and then other parts of the water balance for the stream unit. So withdrawals, evaporation, seepage, storage, and chemistry balance for the unit. So the inputs and the outputs of nitrogen, phosphorus, and the storage, and any point sources. So you can get all of this data out of the model once you've run it. And then we mentioned a bit about what parameter calibration means. So that's adjusting your parameter values. So we assess what parameter values we should put in based on what we know about the soil and the vegetation, etc. But there's always a lot of uncertainty about that. So then we might adjust if our stream flow output is not looking the way that we expect it to against the observed. Oh, sorry, automatic progression there. So just graphically again, these graphs show the modeled output of stream flow is the blue dotted line, and the observed from a stream flow gauge is the black line. And so you might have an output that looks like this on the left. So you can see that the stream flow output of the model is not matching up with the observed that well. I mean, the events are happening at the same time, but the peaks are too high, and then the low flow is too low. And then on the right, you can't really see the modeled line where it is fitting up nicely with the black observed line. It's fitting much better. So the peaks are much better generally. There's always going to be some mismatch because our data is not perfect, but it generally looks a lot better than the one on the left. And that's through adjusting parameter values, often like properties of the soil, because we're generally quite uncertain about those, and exactly what the soil depth is over the aquifer. We can measure those things at individual points, but then we're making assumptions for the entire landscape often. So we generally have to adjust those quite a bit. And it can improve calibration. So that was kind of an overview of theory behind the modeling and how it's calculating stuff and what it's calculating. And then we also looked into, but through doing the tutorial and other parts of the sessions last year, we looked at how the SWAT plus modeling software looks like. And there's QSWAT, which is a plugin within QGIS, and then there's the SWAT plus editor. So QSWAT is that SWAT plus button you load up into your QGIS software as a plugin, and then you use that. It leads you through the spatial setup of the SWAT model. So putting in all your GIS inputs, and it helps you delineate the streams and the catchments, floodplain versus upland, all based on the digital elevation model that you put in, and define your HRUs using your land cover maps and your soil maps and your slope classes. So that's setting up the model structure. It's helping, and it assigns numbers and ID numbers to everything. So all the HRUs have ID numbers, and it knows which HRUs are in which subcatchment and which stream units connected to which one. And it does that all automatically within QGIS. Using, I think, Python coding in the background. But yeah, so it goes through all the functions that sets up everything the SWAT model needs to actually have a structure that runs. And it also has some output visualization tools that we looked at. So after you run the model, it can put the outputs back onto those spatial units for display, which we did look at a little bit in the tutorial. And then there was that SWAT editor, which is a separate piece of software, but they link to each other. So once you're done with the QGIS piece, it pushes, and you can then move to the SWAT editor piece. You can't actually have them both open at the same time, which is a little bit annoying sometimes, but I see why, because they don't want you to be able to, if you edit things, that they talk to one another, and so they don't want you to be able to edit things in the GIS while the other part is running, because it needs to be, the spatial structure needs to be stable when the SWAT plus editor is talking to it. So I think they lock you out of the QGIS when you have the SWAT plus editor open, and then vice versa, I think. And then the SWAT plus editor is where we read in the weather data, and you can edit all those parameter values, and you can edit some elements of the structure by like lumping things, I think, in there. And then that's where it sends all those inputs to the computational code. It does all the math, and then then you can choose which outputs to save there, and then you get your output files. And so we also looked at the SWAT plus file structure last time. So you have a project, when you set up a project, like you did in the tutorial, it makes a project folder for you. And there'll be a QGIS project file that you use to set up your model structure with. And it'll also create these database files. There's the SWAT plus datasets database, and that's the default values. And then there's the one attached to your particular project where it has the values that your model will use. And then there's a watershed folder that stores all the GIS files for your project. So your DEM, your landscape units, your land use map, your soils map, your shape files of your catchments and subcatchments, and some text files that end up there that are about your spatial, your land covering, your soils, and your topography units. And then there's a scenarios folder that it will also generate. That is where the results end up. And they end up in a few different formats. They end up as a database file. And the database files are these SQLite files. If you've ever worked with Microsoft Access, that's a database tool. SQLite is just another database tool. SWAT wanted to move away from using any software you have to pay for, which is why it uses QGIS and why it uses SQLite databases instead of Microsoft Access databases, so that people who don't have a Microsoft subscription could use it, because SQLite is free. But if you've used Microsoft Access, it's a similar type of program. So it stores a lot of SQLite database files. Store many tables that are linked to each other through ID numbers, essentially. And then there's also a text in out folder within the scenarios folder, and that one has everything that's in these SQLite databases, but as separate text files. And those files are the easiest to work with if you do coding. If you want to interact with the data through Python or R or any other coding you do to automate your output processing, you would want to use those text in out files, because it's all the same as what's in the database files, but it's in simple text file versions, but there's loads and loads of them. So if you're not using coding, you probably want to interact with the database files. If you are using coding, you want to interact more with the text in out files. And the text in out also has text file versions of things that are in that inputs database. So that's a bit about the file structure. And then you can put other things inside your project folder. Like I often put all my raw climate data, my DEM and other things in there. When you pick which version of the land cover, etc., you're going to use, it makes a copy of it in that watershed folder. But your original, before you even made the model, you can have another GIS folder in here. You can put whatever you want in the project folder on top, but these things with the arrows, blue arrows, are what it will definitely have when you set up a project and when you run a model. Yeah, so that was a a big overview of all the things we went through in sessions 1 through 5 last year. I tried to pull out the most important stuff. I want to just pause. I will talk a bit about what we went through in particular in the tutorial, but before I do that, are there any things that stuck out to you that you'd like to ask any questions about? Was that making sense? That help a bit to remember what all we went through? Do feel free to. Oh, I see a thumbs up. Yeah, so at least I see some more thumbs up. Okay, great. I hope it helped, and it wasn't everything you already remembered, but oh, and Tando, please go ahead.
Julia, so you talked about sensitivity analysis, but I think I didn't catch the full picture because I was moving around. And I think your focus was only on the stream flow related sensitivity. Are there any other let me say parameters, maybe when you look at the nutrients and other parameters and other things you can do with SWAT in terms of the sensitivity other than stream flow?
Yeah, so there will be, so there are a lot of parameters around that will control the nutrients that you end up, the nutrient outputs in your streams. It will be, so these were from that slide I showed on the sensitivity analysis, or on the most sensitive parameters. That was like a summary based on a lot of literature of other people who have done detailed sensitivity analyses for the hydrology. And there are people have also done that for nutrients. The thing is, before the nutrients and the water quality parameters, it varies a lot depending on how many point sources you have, like from one catchment to another, whether it's very agricultural, very urban, if you have a lot of point sources, if the point sources dominate and stuff. So when you do a sensitivity analysis, it's hard to sort of summarize across diverse literature for that. But for the thing, some parameters that it would be sensitive to. So I wouldn't really consider the point sources as a parameter. The point sources is an input data series. But if those are correct or incorrect, obviously that's gonna change your outputs. But it'll obviously be very sensitive to what your point source inputs are. But that's just a time series that you give it. You say like the flow, you have to give it a daily time series of, or you could do monthly averages and it'll apply the same amount every day if that's all you know. But you would put your point sources of how much water and what's the concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. in that water that's being input. Then from there, it would have parameters that control how that gets processed by the stream, because some of it will get used by algae, some of the algae will die and settle, etc. And so and some of it will like mobilize and stuff. So the parameters that control those things. And then from the non-point source perspective, it'll be sensitive to what we assume about fertilizer application, and what we assume about how erodible the soil is, and what gets carried with the soil. It'll be sensitive to how much, so a lot will be down to the fertilizer application for the non-point sources, and what types of fertilizer, how much, when is it put on, and then the soil parameters that would control whether or not that runs off or stays where it is. So it'll be a lot of the agricultural. So for things like different crop types, or is manure being applied, are chemical fertilizers being applied, and when are they being applied? So it'll be sensitive to our assumptions about that. There'll also be some assumptions about urban areas too, how much wash off there is, how much settling there is on the paved surfaces, and how much wash off there is, and how connected those surfaces are. But I think like a lot will come down to the point source inputs, which aren't really parameters per se. That's like the input data you either have or you don't have, or you're making assumptions about. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So I don't think we'll get there today, but I will be going through what has gone into the model in terms of the land cover, in terms of the water quality related parameters of the land cover, and what we had to assume about the point sources. So I was previously given outputs from the wastewater treatment works data, and then we're updating that. I had it up until mid 2023, and then we're adding the updated ones, updated data to those. And so that I can show you, but that came from, I'm not sure if any of the people on this course work with that data already, so you might have been one of the ones providing it. But yeah, that from your databases. So and then I had to fill gaps. I had to make assumptions when data was missing. I don't know whether the wastewater treatment works was off or on when the data is missing. So sometimes I've had to fill in with averages from other months, like the monthly average for a month of year or assume that it was off and that kind of stuff. So I'll go through what was assumed there, and that's something you can go back and change as needed. Because I know sometimes like the recorders stop recording and whatnot, or the station breaks down and that kind of stuff. So there's assumptions in the point source data. And then there are point sources like leaks that we don't always have good data about, because ideally you'd want to put that in as a flow rate and a concentration, but you don't always have that information. So it's something to think about how those should get put into the model. I was going to, okay, I'll say a bit about the tutorial. It seems like not many people were able to get the model like up and running on their end. And so we can always pick a session where people who want to do that. Not everybody needs to be able to do it, but if you are someone who is likely to be working with this in future, it is good for you to try. And then if you have issues with it, we can do some share screen. I can troubleshoot. If you have any questions for how things are working and why they are not working, we can do that. But what we went through in terms of the sessions last year on the tutorial was we went through the QGIS SWAT plugin steps, delineated streams, delineated catchments, subcatchments, and landscape units, delineated HRUs. And then we went in the SWAT editor, we input climate data, so we saw what it looked like and where you input it, reviewed some of the parameter values, where they sit in this program and how you can change them. And then ran the model. This one was a more simple setup because the data was already prepared. And then we spent time looking at the back end file structure a little bit, which I just showed again. And then we looked at some of the outputs using the SWAT Plus tools that it has. It has some tools for visualizing the time series in the GIS. If you are someone who does some coding, I do think when you have particular things you want to look at, it helps to code those up, because using the SWAT Plus tools works pretty well, but you'll have to click through menus every time you want to redo it to some degree. So coding it up so that you don't have to do that every time you rerun the model or change something is an advantage to be able to do that. Does anybody have any questions on the tutorial now? And also, when do you think I should plan? I can just check in every week and we can spend a little time on it when it comes, but it'd be nice to have a time where I know like a few people will have tried and might have questions to consolidate. So you can think about when that might be, whether it's between now and next week is too short, we can do it the following week. I wanted to try and get an idea of if people had tried and how many questions they have, but I'm not sure if you know that. Does anybody have ideas about that? Okay. I can ask again next time, or I'll ask again via email as well, just to check in about when would be good to block out some time for that part. Before I jump into, I'm gonna jump into a next section for the last 30 minutes. Do people need, we started quite late, but I know you come from one meeting to another meeting. Do we need a 10-minute break or a 5-minute break? Or we switch gears?
Julia, I think the agreement in the room is that we can continue.
Okay. Nice. So,
unless if you need a break from your side, but we can continue.
no, I'm happy to continue.
Okay.
Oh, actually, okay. Let me do just 3. I do need to do one thing. Okay, well, let me continue. Okay. No, I think we can continue. Please. Yeah. Right. So we'll come back to that. So then we wanted to go through I wanted to go through the inputs for the model of the uThukela. Do you have a now the name, it used to be uMngeni water, now it's longer. Do you call it UUW? Do you have an abbreviation that you use for, or do you say the full name every time? Sure. I'll say that.
Yes, we now call it we call ourselves UUW for short.
Is it? Okay. I'll say that. So for this model, I did show this slide before, but I'll update it more. So I'll talk a bit about today about the stream and the floodplain and landscape unit and subcatchment delineation. And then the climate data, the land cover map, soils maps and properties, aquifer properties, dam dimensions, and the point source flows and the water quality. I prepared today, I'm gonna hopefully get through the first 2 to 3 in the next half hour. Let's see, depends on how many questions there are. So for the delineation parts, the DEM data I used was SRTM, 30-meter resolution DEM, and that's freely downloadable online. It comes in tiles, and you have to put the tiles together. That's an ArcGIS mosaic and activity, and then you do like a hydrological correction that finds any when it delineates streams, you want to do ArcGIS has a hydrology fill operation, and the reason for doing that is like sometimes you get one pixel has a low elevation that looks like a pit, and sometimes it actually is a real pit in the topography. But what will happen if you don't do pit filling is that it will make a lake there, which is not really what happens, and it won't be able to delineate the streams properly. So it just fills that in to allow the stream delineation process to be more realistic, or more to allow it to use the algorithm that it uses to do that. And then for the streamline delineation, you might remember from the tutorial that we went through, you have to pick an accumulation area, flow accumulation area, to delineate your streams. So then it knows, like, if it makes that flow, it looks at the topography and which way water would flow from one grid cell to the next grid cell to the next grid cell. And when enough grid cells have accumulated their flow into one spot, it says, okay, now you'll have a stream channel from here on. And that's how it draws the streamlines. And we showed a bit about that. So SWAT Plus will do that with the DEM that you give it. And so I played around with that area. And I delineated streams using a 10 kilometer squared accumulation area, or 1,000 hectares. So that determines points. Well, to do that, I determined points that we want to model the outputs for. So we definitely want where there's stream flow gauges that have data, and where there's water quality monitoring sites that have data. We definitely want to be able to get some outputs for those points. So using the points from DWS and yourselves on where the gauges are and where the water quality monitoring points are, I picked out a set of points that have recent and fairly long-term data, and I mapped those. And then I did this delineation, and I tried to make sure there were streamlines that caught all of those points that I was hoping to catch. So like if you make the streamline delineation area too big, you won't have the little streams. And so if there was a monitoring point on a smaller stream that wasn't delineated, then I needed to make my delineation area small, my contributing area smaller, so that I'd have more streams. So I did that. And then you also look at aerial photography and other national riverline shapefiles and try and see that you're catching enough of the streams that really, where there's channelized flow. So this is what I ended up with. And then to do that landscape unit delineation, In the tutorial, we looked at there were a few different methods you could pick. Here, I've just said what I ended up doing for the UUW model. I used the DEM inversion method. I used a 30 km square ridge threshold and a 10% slope threshold, and I did modify it a bit. So those numbers don't need to mean anything to you, but the way, just how I played around with things to pick a lowland landscape unit delineation, and I did that by also looking at the ARC land type unit delineations. I don't know if you guys are familiar with ARC land units, but they are these land units that the Agricultural Research Council delineated like in the 70s, but people use them for a lot of things, and they did soil surveying by those types, and it's a mixture of topography and geology. But they sort of map lowlands and floodplains as well. So I tried to pick something that captured a bit of what the ARC land types had similar boundaries for the lowland floodplain areas. And those that setup captured it as best I could. I did do some manual alteration. Areas that had a greater, sometimes you have cliffs quite near the stream in the topography where you have hard rock. And so I thought those wouldn't be considered floodplain. And the SWAT's way of delineating this doesn't account for the actual slope of the land. It looks at relative position, but not the actual slope. And so anything that had over a 10% slope, I said it's actually not you wouldn't call that floodplain per se. So I excluded those manually. And then for subcatchments, yeah, that's what I was gonna fix. There's more than 160 subcatchments in this image. I had the wrong shapefile turned on, but delineated subcatchments down to water to stream flow gauges, and I had 26 gauges that have recent and ongoing data, and then water quality monitoring points that have recent and a fair bit of data. And then also points, you want subcatchments at the outlets of major reservoirs and also major stream confluences. And then also quaternary catchment outlet points. So the quaternary catchments, a lot of their outlets are at the end where there is a gauge or where there is a reservoir, but some of them are not. So I made sure there was a delineation outlet point at those, just because you can compare it to other national other national hydrological models if you have an output at the quaternary boundary. So I added those as points that we delineated subcatchments for. And then SWAT Plus will automatically generate a subcatchment at confluences between streams. So in this image, you see the DEM is the colorful background, the elevation map, and all the blue lines are the streams, and the pink lines are subcatchments that it delineates automatically. And so every time two streams meet each other, it makes a new subcatchment. But that gives you a lot of subcatchments. I think there's actually 400 something in this image. But that will give you a lot of model units, and it'll slow the model down quite a lot. And if you don't need separate outputs for every one of those little pieces, it's worthwhile lumping some of them. So I had to do that a bit manually to get to a smaller number where I still have breaks at the streamflow and water quality monitoring points and the reservoirs and the confluences, the quaternary catchments. So that's how the subcatchments were delineated. I say near 100, there's 163 in one version, but I've had to edit a few things. So I think it's I think it's like 167. No, I will get that right. That was I was going to check that at the break, but it's not that important. But do you have any questions about how this process is done? We can come back to things too if you have questions on other days and you want to come back to any of these things. And so we did a simpler, like a version of this in the tutorial with a smaller area. So this takes longer, which is why I used the tutorial. And then preparing the climate inputs for the UW model. The primary data set it chose to use in this version is HydroNet, which is a data service. You might know, you probably know more about this than me, actually. I was given the data from your databases from HydroNet. So UW has a subscription to HydroNet, and HydroNet, from what I understand, produces a data set that uses South Africa Weather Service radar, station data, and some satellite data, I think from CHIRPS. And I'm not sure if they have their own modeling or if they use, CHIRPS has some modeling in it. And they combine those to get a spatial rainfall product that's produced on a 4-kilometer resolution, which is the grid cells you have there. Solid, but I'm just showing the grid cells that overlap the area that's being modeled at a 4-kilometer resolution. And the data is available from near the end of 2019 through the end of 2025, well, ongoing. But I accessed the data last December, that's the last time I got it. And it's hourly data. And so to take that data and create the SWAT inputs, which are time series, what I did was I just made a time series for every HydroNet grid cell. So I assumed every one of those grid cells is actually like a rainfall station that's located in the middle of the grid cell. Because the SWAT model was designed for station data input, but you do an approach like this to do a gridded, to have inputs from a gridded product if you want to. If you had a much finer resolution gridded product than this, you probably wouldn't do it quite this way. You would like pick zones, not every grid cell of the product, but this one is a 4-kilometer resolution. So the grid cells are decently big. So I just went ahead, and I think there's like 600 and something grid cells here. So I treated every one of those like it's a rainfall station, which is not really, but there is a rainfall estimate for each one of those. So I took the data, oh, sorry, it says resample to hourly. I resampled to daily. Apologies, I'll fix that. In the slide, it says resample to hourly. I resampled to daily, and then there were quite a lot of data gaps in the HydroNet data. And we need to have data for every day. So I used CHIRPS data to patch that, and I'll tell you how on the next slide. And I also used CHIRPS data to extend the time period back a bit from end of 2019. I extended it back to 2015, so you could do a warm-up period. And it's good to be able to run the model for a bit of time before you actually want to look at the outputs, because you need the soil moisture and the storage in dams and the storage in the groundwater to warm up, if you will, because you have to put in initial storage. It's also quite important for the groundwater if you put too much groundwater on day one in the aquifer, it'll drain out, and then that draining out it'll drain out maybe too fast, and so you'll have too much water at the beginning of your simulation and the base flow, and then not enough later on. So you might need, it's good to run it for a few years before to get your base flows more realistic, because the amount of groundwater on that first day of the simulation might be quite off. And it's the same with the soil moisture, but that equilibrates more quickly. You'd need a few, depending on the seasons and what your soil, how deep your soil is and stuff. But it's good to run it for a few years. And so some people add dummy data, or they run the first years of their simulation over and over before the start. But if you can actually extend the climate time series backwards, like before the time period that you really want to look at. So I wanted to use all the HydroNet data that we have, because it actually speaks to like local measurements. I did use the satellite data from CHIRPS to go backwards to 2015. And so to do that with CHIRPS, so CHIRPS, for people who don't know CHIRPS, it's a rainfall data product from the Climate Hazards Group CHIRP stands for Climate Hazards Group Infrared Precipitation with Station Data. So they use interpretation of satellite data, infrared data looking at cloud cover and cloud temperature and stuff. And then they also use station data from a global network to calibrate their assumptions to estimate rainfall. And it's the station network that they use does have quite a few stations in Africa, but you can imagine it's quite sparse. So you don't generally assume the accuracy is going to be great, but it performs better than some other products. There are a lot of rainfall satellite products and global climate model products and stuff, but CHIRP's it tends to do okay for Africa. The magnitudes can be quite off, and the highs and lows can be quite off. But whether or not it rains or not on a day is okay, and like the monthly stats are often not bad. I think it often does too little for the peaks and too much for the low rainfalls, but it's we're not using it as a primary data set in this case. We just used it to patch gaps and just used it to do that warm-up period. So I wasn't too worried about its inaccuracies for that, but I downloaded from Google Earth Engine. And I've tried to do this in a way such that if you guys want to update the time series going forward, if you're using this going forward, you could repeat, like ideally, if HydroNet data continues to be produced, you could just append the new HydroNet data as it is the same grid cells onto the time series. But if there are more gaps that need to be filled, etc., I've coded up how I did this. And so I've got the codes for doing the patching, processing the HydroNet data, and adding the CHIRPs, modifying the CHIRPs data, and filling in the gaps with it. So if somebody uses Python code, they could redo it to make a longer time series if you wanted to do it for like in another couple of years if you want to update it or whatnot. So CHIRPs I downloaded from Google Earth Engine, and Google Earth Engine has anybody here used Google Earth Engine before? If you were going to be extending the time series, you would need to download more CHIRPs data. So I can provide the codes for that. I see some thumbs up. So I've just showed the interface here, and I have a code to bring down the CHIRPs data, or to download the CHIRPs data. It goes into my Google Drive, and then I can process from there. So what I did, when you bring the data down, when you download the data from a global data set using Google Earth Engine, you can upload a shapefile. So I uploaded the grid cells from HydroNet, and I said spatially average, give me the spatial average for CHIRPs for every day for each grid cell using the ID numbers of the grid cells. And so what it gave me time series for every grid cell, matching the 4 kilometer grid cells of HydroNet. So then I had the CHIRPs data for the HydroNet grid cells, and then I looked at the days with overlapping data for each, and found the ratio between them for each grid cell, and then it modified the CHIRPs data for that, and then it used the modified CHIRPs to patch for the gaps and extend the data. So then you also have to format the inputs into the SWAT input format. And so for each climate variable, so I'm just showing for rainfall, but you have to do it for each one. So you have to prepare a station location file. So in this case, I did the station locations are the centers of each one of these grid cells, and then you need the latitude and longitude and elevation of each, the quote unquote station. So these, again, they weren't stations, but they're the HydroNet grid cells. So I used GIS and I reformatted to get that. So like you have this location file that you have to give SWAT so it knows where all the points are. So it has the lat, the long, and the elevation, and it's a text file. That's the location file. And it also has this code that links to the station name. And then you have a station, you have a file that matches that station name, and that text, each one of these text files has the time series data. And then for SWAT inputs, the time series data has it's a series of text files again, where it has the first line is the date, the first date. So this is 2015, the 1st of January is when this daily time series starts, and then every line after that is the rainfall amount. So this 2015 data, like you can see there's some repeated numbers here and stuff. That's because this data is from CHIRPS and it's modeled. So like you have these, you wouldn't have like 2 days with exactly 7.987 amount of rain one day after the next in real life, but that's the CHIRPS output data like that. But so this would be, this is the rainfall in the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, etc. So you had to prepare these text files. So there's a text file for each one of these grid cells as the rainfall input. So there's a time series for every one of those grid cells. So I've coded up using Python the preparation of that from HydroNet data and from CHIRPS data to make these time series in the SWAT format. And so in that tutorial, we went through how that gets input in the SWAT model. But in the tutorial, the data was already pre-prepared for the example. So I'm just telling you how you might get there if you're preparing your own climate data. Does anybody have questions on that part? On the rainfall input? So that's the rainfall input. And I hopefully the HydroNet data is a product that will continue because it is nice to have a more local, locally informed, spatially distributed rainfall data set. But I don't have direct contact with them. But that's what we've used as input here. And so the other climate inputs, I think looking at the time, I'm gonna go through I'll be quick on that part. And then we'll skip over to the land cover because I think it's only 10 minutes. So the other rainfall inputs, the other climate inputs were our temperature, min and max temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. And I'm just going to escape the presentation for a sec and show you, where is it? I want to show. Is anyone familiar with the ERA 5 data set? Has anybody used ERA 5 before? Okay. There we go. This one. ERA 5 is what they call a reanalysis product. And I used ERA 5 land daily aggregate data. So ideally, like if you had a weather station, you would get all the, if you had a full weather station, you could get all those parameters. I didn't have access to SAWS weather stations. UUW might have stations, but to get a spatial distribution, I used the ERA 5 dataset. Now this dataset is modeled. It has some CHIRPS data to drive some of the rainfall in it. They do use station data in it, but again, it's sparse over Africa, but it does provide all the variables one needs, and it's reasonably okay. The rainfall is the most important data set, but as a way of getting all the other climate inputs in a spatially distributed and okay fashion without having full weather station data, I used ERA 5, and it has bands for, like, here's temperature, it has dew point temperature. It has all these different bands of, because it's from climate model and the land surface model. So it does have wind, and it has dew point temperature. So I could get the min and max temperature from there's a min and max temperature field. So you can download these different parameters from ERA 5. Yes, and it has solar radiation and it has min and max temperature. I think they come, yeah, further down, but it has all the variables one needs for this at a high spatial resolution. So I used Google Earth Engine again to download those in the format that they're in. So I use that catalog of what data it has, and then you can download the dew point temperature. So to get relative humidity, it doesn't have relative humidity itself, but it has dew point temperature and then straight up temperature, and so, or air temperature. So between dew point temperature and air temperature, you can calculate relative humidity. And then it has wind speed, it has temperature, min and max, yeah. So I can provide these codes for downloading this to anyone who might be updating data. And then I had to code to get the units, to switch the units. So like I said, it has dew point temperature, but it doesn't have relative humidity. But if you have min and max temperature or average temperature, and then you have dew point temperature, you can calculate relative humidity. And it has wind, the wind data that it has is in 2 different directions. So it has wind speed, directional wind speed. So you get the wind speed for the 2 different directions. One's like north-south, one's east-west. If you get those, you have to do some math to combine them to just get straight wind speed magnitude, which is what SWAT needs. And then SWAT needs temperature, min and max, and solar radiation. So I coded downloading this for those same grid cells and converting them into the units that SWAT needs. And that's how you prepare your input data for SWAT. So you have like your relative humidity. It's the same formatting as the rainfall. You have these text files, it has the date at the top, and then it has the relative humidity for every day, for every grid cell. Same goes for solar radiation, temperature, and wind. And then you have these location files that give the latitude, longitude, and elevation of every one of these grid cell points. So that's how I prepared the climate input, and then you input that in the SWAT editor as we did in the robot tutorial. Does anybody have any questions on the other climate variables at all? If we need to extend them, I would, yeah, we'll turn over the code, give the codes to anyone who wanted to extend. Sorry, Ntando, you have your hand up.
I wanted to find out if you did check with Jason, if we do have other climate parameter, variables on HydroNet, because I know that for some stations we do have max and minimum temperature. And another thing I wanted to find out about the ERA 5 climate data that you used is whether you did any correction on the data, because maybe that data may be coming from a course or global coverage and may not be that's applicable to smaller catchments. If you did any correction, we would like you to go through that process as well, so that we can know if we were to do it ourselves, what type of bias correction would be needed. Yeah.
Right. So actually, I didn't do any correction to the ERA 5 land data. If there are other climate variables in HydroNet, I wasn't told, like I did ask, but I should ask again if there are station points data, or if they have He didn't mention, but maybe there is a temperature product. So I left the Era 5 land data as it is. I just converted units as needed. The rainfall is really the key one, but it would be good if it is more off to adjust the temperature. And so it wouldn't, and it won't be that hard. I think well, the thing is, if it depends what the spatial distribution of the other data is. Like if we just have 1 or 2 stations here and there for the temperature, we would compare them, but it's hard to know how you would adjust across the entire space. If the difference was in different directions in different places, if you see what I mean. Like if you've got 3 stations across this whole area, and one of them is greater than Era 5 and the other one's much lower than Era 5 and the other one is, but like I wouldn't know exactly how to adjust all of the Era 5 data across the space unless you have quite a lot of climate stations. But I will ask again. I think the workflow of like bringing the data in and then changing the format, that's all coded up. And if there is a fairly simple correction factor, that's something that's easy to apply and then input. If it's a complicated correction process, I wouldn't be able to add that at this point, but we can try and add it in future. I think the rainfall is the most critical input, but yeah, the evaporative demand is like the second one, so it would be good, but I didn't focus as much on it as I did with the rainfall. But I take the note to go and ask and check about that. Thanks. Yeah, does UW Water, do you guys have your own weather stations at all, or using SOARs primarily and HydroNet?
Julia, I think we do not have maybe I'll say we do not have weather stations installed by uMngeni uThukela Water, but we do have a few rain gauges that are installed in one of our, mostly it's our dams, but just rain gauges that are installed, and I think they were in a process of installing more rain gauges for all systems. But at the moment, I'll say that data is not that reliable, because even us, we rely on the source weather stations data for detailed assessments.
Great, but I will check in with Jason and others to see if I should adjust if it's worth trying. We can look at what would be involved there with the other climate variables. Forward. I see it's 4. I can't actually stay later. I know we started late, but I can't stay later, unfortunately, because I have another commitment. But I'll condense some of the other material and we'll get through more next week. And please do start thinking about, like I did mention for land cover, I've had to, because of when we're doing this, I did have to make assumptions about the land cover types to include explicitly, but there is still time to change and alter parameters for them. So I'll present how that worked next week, and we can look at that. All right. But if you have other questions, please do feel free to email me or write them down so that we can address them for next week. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll kick off with land cover and soils and some of the parameters around that next week. Bye.
Thank you, Julia. Bye.
You're welcome. Hi.
Thank you, Julia. Bye.
Bye.